Well, this is new territory for me. I've ranked all the Nintendo consoles and controllers, and it only felt right to do the same with Sony's consoles and handhelds. I'll be ranking them based off how well they've aged and the features they currently have, as well as the game library and overall enjoyability. So with that, let's get her ranked. 22. PSP Go. I feel really bad about putting this smexy handheld so low on the list, because I'm such a sucker for sliding devices. My first phone was the LG Neon, and it had this awesome physical keyboard and I was addicted to it as a teenager, so having my hands on this device brings back a nostalgic burst of joy. But there's only one problem. It's a digital-only system that I can't use. My experience with the PSP Go is a perfect example of why physical games should always be an option. I never owned a PSP until now, and I didn't have a way to download any PSP games because the online store shut down. But there is a loophole. If you download a PSP game on your PS3 or Vita, you just have to connect the PSP to one of those consoles and you can get it that way. The only problem is my Wi-Fi encryption does not work with the PSP, which means I had to open a mobile hotspot on my phone and turn off the password just to get it connected. But digital gaming's the future though, right? And honestly, the PSP Go isn't even that comfortable to hold. The nubby little joystick is in an awkward spot, and the R and L buttons are too close to the screen. I genuinely feel awful about this situation, and will probably mod one of the PSPs at some point so it's actually useful, but modding capabilities aren't being considered for this list. 21. PlayStation Classic. Well, at least I can actually play games on this one. And my god, the console's so cute! Look at how tiny it is! I'm such a sucker for mini consoles. You never expect the size difference, and it always makes for a good first impression. But that's about it. A first impression. It comes with 2 controllers, which is actually pretty great, but why on earth aren't these the analog versions? I get it. The PS1 originally launched without them, and most games don't use them, but these have not aged well at all. At least with Nintendo's NES and SNES Classic controllers, those are still fun to use and function well in the modern day. That's not the case with the PlayStation controllers. Oh, and if you were wondering, these Classic controllers are a tiny bit smaller in scale compared to the original, and also a lot lighter. As someone with bigger hands, I wish these were the same size, but it's really not that big of a deal. I love how the ends look exactly the same too, outside of the USB of course. I will say that at the very least, the start and select button feel a lot better to press than the OG versions, so I guess there's that. But of course, I'm obligated to bring up the PAL versions of the games that don't run at the right speed, and the game selection is missing so many key titles like Crash, Tomb Raider, Silent Hill, Spyro, yada yada yada. But how about that lack of an AC adapter? And look, it's not like you don't have one laying around the house somewhere, but did they really need to save pennies just to inconvenience us? For what it is, the PlayStation Classic is fine if you only want to dabble with PlayStation games and never have before. I definitely appreciate that the menu is based off the original PS1 menu, that's a really cool touch, but if you don't mod it and add more games, you only have a selection of 20 to pick from, so there really isn't much here long term. 20. PlayStation. Aw yeah, one of the best console startup screens ever. That sound has this way of raising the hairs on your arms, almost absorbing you into the game you're about to play. It's so basic yet powerful at the same time. This console dominated the market. It released before the Nintendo 64 did and ended up selling over 100 million units. The design is just a basic box, but it has depth for where the CD goes, which was an interesting choice. The buttons feel great to press, by the way. They have a nice firmness to them. So while it was a huge success, there's not much of a reason to go back unless you're nostalgic for the games. And it still has a great library. Some of these include Final Fantasy VII, Gran Turismo, Tekken, Crash Bandicoot, Resident Evil 2, Metal Gear Solid, and Spyro, just to name a few. You could also play audio CDs, which at the time was a killer feature. Now originally, the console came out with a controller without analog sticks. The general design is so iconic that it's still being used to this day, but this first version doesn't feel great to hold. Trying to play 3D games with the D-pad is a little clunky to say the least. but later on they came out with the dual analog controller, which was the same thing but with two nicely sized clickable analog sticks. While these are better, you have to push a button to activate the analog, and some games don't even support that. Something I find a little odd is how close the memory card slot is to the controller. I feel like if you're not paying attention, you could easily pull out the memory card if you're trying to swap out a controller or something. There's also some reported issues of loud ticking, which is a problem with games not being able to load properly. So while it's still a nice system, there's other ways to play PS1 games. 19. PlayStation 1. Wow, Sony is just as good at naming consoles as Microsoft and Nintendo are. I'd almost consider this the Game Boy Micro for Sony, since it released the slimmer version very shortly before the PS2 launched. While I adore the original console, this update looks a lot sleeker, and making it smaller is a big plus for how many consoles I have hooked up already. It also only cost $100 at launch, which even back then was a great value. The controller has a different color scheme too. It's light gray for the shell, and the buttons are a bit brighter. I prefer the original's dark and sharp colors, but this one has its place. There aren't any other changes beyond that. It's interesting to note that the startup screen has a different menu when you don't have a disc in, so that's kinda cool, but the power adapter is a bit obnoxious because look how massive this brick is. I hate when electronics put the brick on the end with the plug. Just put it in the middle where it isn't obtrusive. Unfortunately, mine has the ticking issue I brought up earlier. So even though mine doesn't work properly, I'd still say it's better just for its smaller form factor. 18. PSP Street. Nintendo's budget Wii was the Wii Mini. The PSP has PSP Street. This was sold in the PAL regions only, and a lot of features were removed. There's no Wi-Fi, the speakers are monaural instead of stereo, and there's no microphone. The buttons on the bottom have been changed drastically as well. Instead of distinct physical buttons, it's all one long panel. And while the buttons work, it's not anywhere near as satisfying or easy to push as a normal button. You've probably noticed the brightness button is missing too. Now you have to go into the power save settings menu to adjust the brightness. So obviously, a lot of the features were cut to lower the cost, but you might as well just get one of the regular PSPs. 17. PSP 1000. And speak of the devil, here we've got the original. It competed with the Nintendo DS, which they didn't even come close to toppling, but it still sold 81 million units, which isn't a failure if you ask me. It's still an incredible piece of tech, even to this day. The most unique feature, of course, is UMD. Each game comes on these tiny little discs encased in plastic with a small opening for the laser to read the data, and you just pop them in from the back. I immediately thought of GameCube discs, and funny enough, they're actually smaller in size. While it's kind of incredible that they got a disc system working on a handheld, it probably wasn't the greatest idea. The disc makes loud spinning noises sometimes, and it's like this for every PSP. The spinning sound isn't the end of the world, but it's a little distracting sometimes. Playing games on this is pretty comfortable for the most part. It feels really nice in the hands, but there's a couple drawbacks for every PSP variant. The biggest one, of course, being the little joystick. I like the addition of having one for 3D games, but the build quality is pretty mediocre. My finger feels like it's slipping all the time. The core's texture just doesn't have enough friction, and these things break pretty easily. All of my joysticks are a little squeaky and have lost their smoothness when making turns. I know that comes with age, but it does make playing 3D games a little annoying. What the PSP has that the DS doesn't is all the multimedia features. I personally don't care for these things in game consoles, but their inclusion back in the day was pretty remarkable. You got a fully functional web browser, remote play with the PS3, storage for photos and music, and you can even watch movies. Yep, you can straight up buy UMD movies. I got Big Daddy to try it out because that's all that was at the store. And you know, the movie quality was actually pretty solid considering how old the PSP is now. Nowadays, all this multimedia stuff is easily accessible on your phone or computer, so they don't have much use anymore. But for what the PSP did, it's a really sleek and unforgettable fella. 16. PSP 2000, or some called it the slim version. It's much lighter and even has more internal storage for the system software. The 1000 was rocking a massive 32 megabytes, while the 2000 has 64 megabytes. This extra space improves the loading times a little bit too. Since it's lighter, playing games for long periods of times is easier to do. To insert UMDs, you have to pull the slot open instead of using an eject switch, and they made the opening much easier for insertion. Also, the buttons are apparently more responsive, but I didn't really notice a difference. So overall it is better, but software-wise it runs and functions basically the same. 15. PSP 3000. Looking at the 2000 and 3000, it's really hard to tell the differences. But there's actually a few improvements, with the main one being a brighter LCD screen with a wider color range. It's also a teeny tiny bit smaller, but you won't be able to spot that as the differences are near negligible. The logo and a couple of buttons look slightly different as well, and that's about it. It's one of the most minor upgrades I think I've ever seen with a handheld. Well, outside of maybe the Game Boy Advance SP getting an upgrade with a brighter screen, and nothing else. 14. PlayStation TV. This is a wonderful idea on paper. The ability to play PS Vita games on the big screen is a great idea, and it's also backwards compatible with anything you can buy in the PlayStation Store. But wait, I'm not able to add money to the PlayStation Store anymore. And only some PS Vita games are compatible. You heard me right, only some of them. Logically, that makes sense because the Vita has the touchscreen and touchpad on the back, and you can't obviously emulate that with a PS3 controller, which was originally the only controller that worked with the PS TV. They eventually added support for the PS4 controller so you could use the touch bar to emulate the touchscreen games, but that didn't help much with the bizarre compatibility issues. I purchased 4 PS Vita games for this video, and I can play a total of 0 of them. Why doesn't Monkey Ball work? All I'm doing is using a joystick. But lucky for me, there's already some games preloaded from the previous owner, so I could at least try it out. And I gotta admit, I had a good time with it. I didn't really notice any input lag, and the visuals look pretty nice on the screen. Hardware-wise, I really like the small form factor, but there's no rubber feet. That's kind of a big issue when the device is so light. That makes it really easy to get knocked around. I am so conflicted on the PS TV because it has so much potential and it's a cool idea, but the fact that I can only load up some PS Vita games makes this worth very little unless you mod it. 13. PS Vita, the console that unfortunately did not get the support it deserved and ended up flopping. A measly 10 to 15 million in sales is pretty awful for how jam-packed the Vita is, and it's too bad because it's a beautiful piece of technology. The joysticks have been vastly improved for one. You actually have a pretty good grip on them, and they don't slip out of your hands during use. There's an OLED touchscreen with a much higher resolution, 2 cameras and a microphone, motion controls, a touchpad on the back screen, and PS Vita games revert back to cards, which looks strangely similar to the Switch's cards. But yeah, there are so many upgrades over the PSP. The menu UI is really slick too. Now, there's a couple reasons why the Vita didn't really take off. One of the smaller ones is the proprietary memory cards. At this point in time, SD cards were very common for portable storage purposes and still are, but Sony wanted to cash in and made their own PS Vita specific cards. This is a huge pain in the neck for people that wanted to download a lot of games. It was completely unnecessary to make it this way. The biggest reason for the Vita's financial failure is just that Sony didn't make a lot of games for it. It's almost like they sent it out to die. And honestly, the games that they did make were really similar to what's already on the PS3 and PS4. I played Uncharted Golden Abyss, and while I was really impressed and having a good time, I was kind of wondering why I wasn't just playing Uncharted on PS4. The point of a handheld is to play games that are more catered to on the go, or at least that's how it used to be. And of course, there were a lot of games like that, but so many of the AAA titles were just watered down versions of what's already on the console. I mean, just look at the top 5 selling games: Uncharted Golden Abyss, Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation, Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified, Little Big Planet PS Vita, and Persona 4 The Golden. With that said, the PS Vita store is pretty awesome and surprisingly still up today. There's a bunch of indie games on there, as well as PS1 classics and PSP games. So there's definitely value with that despite it being harder to add money, but games from other consoles should complement the library, not overtake it. 12. PS Vita 2nd Gen, a thinner and lighter PS Vita. It replaces the OLED screen with LCD, which allows for an extra hour or so of battery life. While the screen might not look quite as good, it's still fantastic and isn't that substantial of a downgrade. The only other change is how the console is charged. It switches to using a more traditional micro USB. While that's nice and all, they should have added SD card support on top of that, which frankly it might have been too late to make that change as compatibility with the other Vita might have been a problem, but adding 2 different slots would have been appreciated. I also really like the start and select buttons. They're a little bit bigger and just better in general. There's no reason to not go with the slim model over the original, unless you really care about the OLED screen. 11. PlayStation 2. This was the first console I purchased specifically for YouTube over a decade ago, so my experience with it is very different to many others. In case you live under a rock, the PS2 is the best-selling game console of all time, topping off at 155 million units sold, goddamn. That is absolutely bonkers, and funny enough, a lot of people weren't buying this for the games. The PS2 was able to play DVDs, which was a huge deal when the console launched. DVDs were taking off like crazy in the 2000s, and buying a PlayStation 2 was a great value since it could play DVDs, PS2 games, and it was backwards compatible with PS1 games. That means the PS2 could play over 10,000 games. Even the PS1 memory cards work. The original design of the console is very different to the PlayStation 1. It's a wide black box with a smaller chunk on the bottom. It's definitely a bulky guy, but it also has 2 USB ports, which was a very new thing for consoles. Something I learned is that there were limited edition PS2s with wacky colors. Why the hell didn't we get this? I want that bright yellow one, that looks freaking sick. The controller also feels a bit more premium. They didn't add much to it, but there wasn't really a reason to. The start and select buttons feel less mushy, which is a nice change, and vibration is included as well as pressure sensitive buttons. Hell, you could even connect online, but you needed a network adapter for that to work. The games themselves are pretty incredible, with titles like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Final Fantasy X, Jak and Daxter, God of War, and so many more. The PS2 is a juggernaut in carving out the gaming landscape, and set a standard with what a top-selling console looks like. 10. PlayStation 2 Slim. I cannot believe how tiny this thing is, and the disc drive opens from the top. I don't know why I'm so fascinated with consoles that do this. I just like the analog feel of plopping in a disc and closing it up securely. Playing online was a lot easier too, since the networking ports are built into the console. It's pretty much the exact same as the regular PS2, but a lot smaller. The only main thing that's missing is the expansion bay, so there isn't an internal hard drive, but for the sheer tiny size, it more than makes up for it. 9. PSX. By far the heaviest console I've ever held in my life. This thing weighs in at a whopping 13 pounds. It does everything a PlayStation can do, and it's also a DVR. You've probably never seen this console before, because it only came out in Japan and is forgotten about nowadays. It also comes with a remote, and dude, this thing is pretty awesome. Look at that little joystick. So precious. Hell, you can link a PSP to this guy and transfer photos, videos, and music. That is insane to me. This box can do just about anything. And the menus use the cross-media bar UI. It's so interesting to see this UI carry over to so many different PlayStation consoles. The only disadvantage is just its sheer size. It's not very living room friendly, as it'll take up a lot of space on your shelf. You also have to hook your controller up to the back, and the memory cards are in the front, which is super odd. There are a ton of inputs back here. The components are used for either the PS2 or DVR, and it's also region locked, but that's to be expected from most older consoles. But man, this beast is such a cool piece of history. It reminds me a lot of Nintendo's Panasonic Q. 8. PlayStation 3 Slim. We've finally gotten to a PlayStation console that I've actually put a lot of time into. The PS3 Slim introduced me to Call of Duty, Tetris, Minecraft, The Last of Us, and HD graphics. The switch from 480p on the Wii to 1080p on PS3 was mind-boggling. It's really hard to find words to explain how amazing the jump was when you spent the first 16 years of your life only having things like the Game Boy, N64, and GameCube. The Slim model had a lot more hard drive space compared to the original, and it was desperately needed considering downloading entire games was becoming more and more common. Models were going from 120 to 320 gigabytes, which back in the day was a decent amount. There's also 2 different controllers, the 6-axis and DualShock 3. Both controllers are similar, but the main difference is the DualShock is heavier, much more durable, and includes rumble. Both controllers are also wireless, which is an awesome upgrade, but can be plugged in for wired play if you're looking for that. I really like how a PS3 controller feels in your hands. The ergonomics were starting to get really good with this variation. While you can still play DVDs, Blu-ray support was added in, which is what PS3 games run off of. The biggest downgrade with the PS3 Slim and Super Slim is the fact that PS2 games are no longer backwards compatible. That really takes a big toll on the console. Losing a library that large is pretty brutal. But at least PS1 games still work, and you can buy PS2 games off the store. Well, at least until the store is up. Sony will probably take it down in the next few years, despite the backlash they had recently. One of the most annoying things about all the PS3s is how often you had to update your console. It's almost as bad as Steam, if not worse. Like seriously, as a teenager, I'd log in a few times a week, and almost every time I had to update. The store itself was also super laggy, but that might have just been my internet speeds at the time. And it's also free, so I can't complain that much. You've also got options to manage photos and videos, but I never found much incentive to utilize this stuff. The game library is pretty incredible too, and I haven't even played that much of it. You've got Grand Theft Auto 5, the Batman Arkham series, the Uncharted series, Dark Souls, Red Dead Redemption, and that's just a tiny amount of what's out there. I've had so many good memories with the PS3, and it's aged surprisingly well. 7. PlayStation 3 Super Slim. It's another PS3, but even smaller. They call it Super Slim, but honestly, it's still pretty beefy. Some key differences is the inclusion of larger storage options and a different way of inserting discs. The disc tray opens up from the top. You can slide it open with your hands or push a button. The materials do feel a little on the cheap side, but I definitely prefer consoles that let you physically take discs out like this. I've got an Xbox 360 with Sonic 06 trapped in it because the disc tray won't open. That would never be a problem with the Super Slim, but that's really about it. Again, I find the smaller consoles a little more appealing. 6. PlayStation 4. For the most part, we basically just go in order for the rest of this list. The one big downside about the PS4 is that it isn't backwards compatible with any PlayStation 1 through 3 games. But at this point, it's getting more and more unrealistic to expect that, so I get it. What I do have a concern for is disc games. They're no longer played off a disc, but instead are entirely downloaded onto the hard drive, which takes up a lot of space. This is just a little concerning for the future of games and their longer usability and preservation, but for the time being, it's not that big a deal outside of waiting for games to download all the content the first time, and once they are downloaded, you're good to go outside of the occasional update. Speaking of updates, the PS4 doesn't get nearly as many. They occur much less frequently. The games themselves look better than ever, even with the resolution remaining at 1080p. You'll notice the games run a lot smoother and have much better textures and lighting effects. The difference isn't quite as big compared to the PS2 and PS3, but it's still enough to be noticeable. The load times are also faster than on PS3, and the controller is so much better. They finally revamped it while keeping the same shape. The ergonomics have been refined even more and are somehow more comfortable to hold and grip. The shoulder buttons feel so nice. R2 and L2 have these little grooves that makes pushing those buttons more seamless. Even the joysticks have these little grooves so your thumb won't slip as easily. The extra attention to detail really paid off. As for new features, you can plug headphones into the new controller, and the start and select button will replace with a touch bar, option button, and share button. The touch bar still looks weird to me. You'll use it as a massive button or a touchscreen, but it's not as intuitive as you'd think. Trying to type with it is not fluid at all. The option button is basically the start button now, and the share button lets you take video clips or screenshots and upload them. That is a huge part of the PS4, being able to more easily share your gameplay with your friends or the world. You can also live stream, which is neat, but I'd rather just use OBS for that. All these new features are very much appreciated. Heck, even the menu UI is a massive upgrade. It's much easier to locate where things are, and you won't be scrolling through dozens of submenus anymore. Plus, it's region-free, and you can connect with the PS Vita. So I really dig what the PS4 brings to the table. However, there's two more things to discuss: PlayStation Plus and PlayStation Now. Two different subscription services. Thinking about subscribing to another service is making my mind numb, but I'll give Sony credit. They give you a decent amount of value with PlayStation Plus. You get a full free game every month and discounts on games, so that's not too bad. But you also have to pay for cloud storage and online multiplayer, which kinda sucks. But I get it. This stuff costs a lot to keep running. PlayStation Now, on the other hand, is the biggest waste of money to me. It's a way to stream PlayStation games, and I've never tried that until now. I've got a pretty good internet connection, so the game was running perfectly fine and all, but the games don't last for forever. They all rotate and only stick around for like 3 to 6 months. You can download them to your console too, but what's the point if I can't keep the game? PlayStation Now is basically a virtual blockbuster, and that's perfectly fine and all. It's just not for me since I like owning the things I pay for. There's a lot to say about the PS4. It changed a lot of things I dislike, but overall, it's one of the better PlayStation consoles. 5. PlayStation 4 Slim. It's the PS4 still, but a little bit smaller. I guess I never mentioned the box at all, but both of them have this really strange tilt to them. It really stands out amongst other consoles and looks kinda cool, and they did the same thing with this version. They also updated the USB slots to support 3.1 and added Bluetooth 4.0 and much better Wi-Fi. The only thing that was removed was the optical output, but that's hardly a big deal for most people. It also consumes slightly less power, but still plays games the same. 4. PlayStation 4 Pro. Wow, it's another PS4. But compared to every other console variant for Sony consoles, this one actually upgrades the GPU and CPU. The specs are a lot higher, so games can run in 4K, use HDR, and load faster. So honestly, if you can't find a PS5 like everyone else at the time of this recording, then this is fairly comparable to that. Speaking of, 3. PlayStation 5 digital. I didn't even believe the PS5 was real until I saw it myself, and I'm only half joking because as of right now, they're still very hard and expensive to get. Ranking a brand new console is tricky because we don't know how good its library is going to be, but I think the PS5 could end up being absolutely legendary by the end of its cycle. First things first, this controller is next level. I thought the DualShock 4 was a great upgrade, but they actually made it more comfortable to hold and added features they didn't steal from Nintendo. The new feature we gotta talk about is the adaptive triggers. They have real-time haptic feedback with the game you're playing, which admittedly, it's very hard to explain without trying it yourself. So let's simplify things. Imagine you're trying to pull a car door open. To do this, you have to apply force to the handle to open it. This creates resistance from this. The PS5 triggers are able to apply this same kind of resistance. A good example is shooting a gun. You can feel a real pull and force on the actual button, and let me tell you, it is absolutely incredible. That is technology I wouldn't have even been able to conceive. Astro's Playroom is the game the PS5 is bundled with, and it does an amazing job demonstrating how the controller works. As for the console itself, it looks odd. Some people think it looks awful, but I love the design. And don't think I'm not agreeing with the haters, it looks stupid as shit. But that's what makes it special. I'm never gonna forget that the PS5 looks like a freaking network router. You gotta love its absurd style. But if you look closer at the console, you'll notice that the texture consists of the classic PlayStation buttons. You can even use your PS4 controller with the PS5, but you can only play PS4 games on it, which is fine because it's backwards compatible with like 99% of the library, and a lot of times PS4 games will load much faster thanks to the upgrade in the hardware. Gone are the hard drives. Everything's now running through SSDs and M.2s, which drastically improve the loading speeds. It's almost like the old days of popping in an N64 cartridge and the game just starts. We're actually returning to that era. The UI is also improved yet again, this time doing a better job splitting up the games and media into two different sections. You'll notice that there's zero lag compared to the PS4's menu. Swapping between apps is impressively seamless. PlayStation Plus also offers this new game help feature, which can give you help on the spot you're stuck at in a game. I don't know how that adds any value when you can easily look up the answer for free, but it's an attempt at offering value, I guess. Once the PS5 can be found in stores, I think more people will really appreciate the sheer power it brings. 2. PlayStation 5 Standard. It's the exact same thing, but it has a disc drive. You can tell that Sony wasn't planning on making the PS5 with discs, because it awkwardly sticks out on the side while the digital version is perfectly symmetrical. I'm honestly really glad they're still doing discs, even if they're just DRM at this point and you're playing off the console. I can at least easily carry the game around to other consoles, plus you've got DVD, Blu-ray, and Ultra HD Blu-ray playback as a bonus. 1. PlayStation 3. Assuming you get the first generation model, the original PS3 is capable of playing PS3, PS2, and PS1 games. That level of backwards compatibility is just incredible, and I really wish it was carried over throughout every variant of the PS3. That means you just need this and a PS5 to be able to play just about every PlayStation game out there. The touch buttons for power and ejecting the disc are pretty cool too. Now, the initial launch and price point may have not been its best moment,
$599 US.
but once the console was out for a while, it ended up creating a really impressive library, and the fat version is the best one to boot. This was also the only console that allows you to play Super Audio CDs, by the way. I don't have one to try just because the technology flopped and didn't really think about getting it, but it goes to show just how much this console's capable of. It may be a pretty large boy, but it is well worth it for the insanely large list of games you can play on it. Well, hot mama, was that a lot of new stuff to learn, but it was a lot of fun diving into the PlayStation world for a little bit. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll be back soon. Ta-ta!